Welcome to this introduction to Norfolk's prominent historical family, the Pastons. Animated characters will help share selected highlights from the 15th to 17th century timeline. Each century will get about 10 minutes, with a further 5 minutes for the early 18th century discovery of the letters. So sit back, relax, and discover how the Pastons' resilience, enterprise, and passion for learning fuel this rags to riches to rags story.
Which would you choose if you wanted to be remembered for over 600 years? Would it be fine houses in Norwich or London? Or would it be estates all over Norfolk and Suffolk with sheep and cattle, crops and timber? Or would it be just paper, plain paper, paper letters? 600 years ago, an ordinary family of farmers with one small farm in the village of Paston on the Norfolk coast began an extraordinary rise to power, fame and fortune. The family wrote letters to each other because the men of the family had to go to court to serve the king. In the village of Paston is the parish church of St. Margaret'S. The first St. Margaret's church was looked after by the monks of nearby Bromham Priory. We can only see the remains of Bromham Priory today because the buildings were pulled down by a later king, Henry VIII. When the monks of the priory were there, they gave some land at Paston to the Paston family. We think this was because the Paston family claimed to be descended from William de Glanville, who had founded Bromham Priory. The Pastons farmed the land, but then William Paston, a man we call the Good Judge, was sent to be trained as a lawyer.
I'm William Paston. They call me the Good Judge, mainly because I've been rather successful as a lawyer and as a judge. I work for some very important people, including the Bishop of Norwich, the Mayor of Norwich, and even the King. But my background was not what you might expect. My father Clement was a farmer, a good one, very intelligent, and he was married to Beatrice Somerton. They lived at Paston on the northeast coast of Norfolk, and they had connections at the well-known Bromham Priory nearby. I was told that our ancestor Wilson came over to England just after the Norman conquest, and was related to the man who founded the priory. Still, we would just have carried on being a farming family, except for one thing. My father sent me to study the law. Being a lawyer is a good way of making money and raising your status, if you know what you're doing. I did know what I was doing, and although not everyone liked me, and I had to fight many difficult cases, I was successful. I now travel the country officiating at assizes, courts that decide the hardest cases. As well as being a good lawyer, I bought land that was going cheap because of the plague, and I also married an heiress. Someone who's going to inherit a lot of money. Her name is Agnes Berry, and she comes from Hertfordshire. She is an excellent woman, and we make a good couple. I am also a religious man, and I do my best to support the cathedral in Norwich. I have a son called John, and I have high hopes for him. He is married to another fine woman, Margaret Mortby. She is a great letter writer and a good manager of our estates. The future looks good.
Good day, sir. Good day, madam. I'm Margaret Paston, wife to John Paston. You may know me from my letters. I can only say that I have had an adventurous life, living here in the 15th century as events, including the Wars of the Roses, have unfolded around us. But I was determined to fight for my family. I was born Margaret Maltby and inherited the ownership of a great deal of land from my father. My father and William Paston had known each other for a long time, and together they arranged for me to marry William's son John. I'm pleased to say that John and I got on well together. We had 7 children who grew to become adults. We were very fortunate because so many children died young in those days. My life was full of Johns. Both our eldest 2 boys were christened John after their godfathers, a tradition that could sometimes cause confusion. I tried to write to all of them whenever I could. When I say I wrote to them, I mean that I dictated my letters to one of my clerks. I could write, unlike many other people of my time, but using a quill and repeatedly dipping it in the ink could be a slow and messy business. Some of my letters were written by my son John, the younger John, that is. Have you had a look at some of the handwriting from our time? We even had 2 extra letters in the alphabet, which you now don't use. I had many moments of drama in my life. One was when I was thrown out of the castle here at Gresham. Husband John was in London, trying to sort things out there, so it was down to me and a few servants to try and defend the castle against hundreds of men. But it was hopeless. Our enemies were very strong, and because of the civil war going on across England, the king was not able to keep law and order properly. However, I wasn't going to give up the right to the manor at Gresham that easily. I lived for a while in another house in the village and asked my husband to send crossbows, pole-axes and leather jackets so that we could defend ourselves there. Our enemies made more defences at the castle, but we didn't have the force to attack them. Eventually they came for us, and I was carted out of the house on a chair. What indignity! Consequently, we had to seek shelter in the city of Norwich. My husband John was a lawyer, like his father William. That meant that he had to be in courts in London for much of his work. As a result, I had to try and look after things back in Norfolk, and of course I had to write so many letters. It was my job to check that our manor farmers had paid their rent. I had to look at the records to see how many sheep were kept in the fields, and how much wheat and barley had been harvested. When I wrote to John in London to tell him how we were getting on, it did give me the chance to order some special things, like fine hats and rolls of material. Sadly, my husband John died whilst he was in London. We arranged a great funeral for him at Bromholm Priory, but that meant a long and expensive journey to get him back there. It was a difficult time, of course, and left us with many things to sort out. From then on, I lived as a widow, looking after family matters for 18 years, and I spent much time back home in Maltby. Things eventually became easier, but along the way there were more troubles. Husband John had inherited Caister Castle and its estates from the famous knight Sir John Fastolf. Other people claimed this great castle and estate. My younger son John had to try and defend the castle, and he held out for 5 weeks. But I'll let him tell you that story himself. What a life I've had, and you can see so much of it in my letters.
For many years in the 15th century, my family and I lived comfortably in the glorious Caister Castle, a generous inheritance from our good friend Sir John Fastolf for my father's years of loyal service to him. Close to the coast, surrounded by a moat and boasting a 30-metre tower, it was the envy of many. Although a good home, the castle was built with defence in mind. Clay was dug locally to make the nearly 2 million bricks for the walls. There were no other brick castles like it in England at the time. Arrow slits covered the towers and gun ports were placed on the walls. A special channel was dug from the local river to the castle, making sure the moat remained full of water. Of course, there were those who believed that we weren't the rightful heirs to the castle, that my father had tricked Fastolf into leaving it to him. They said it should belong to them. No one believed that as strongly as the dastardly Duke of Norfolk. Eventually, on a summer's day in 1469, we found ourselves besieged as the Duke marched his men to the walls of the castle. His army was small, but ours was much smaller. We had no more than 30 men, and our few supplies wouldn't last long. My father had died by the time this happened, so my mother Margaret wrote to my brother John. She pleaded with him to do more to help, but he was away in London. Her letters to him became angrier as time went on. When the attack eventually came, it was vicious, with cannon fire, crossbows and handguns. My courageous handful of men and I faced the Duke's artillery and held out bravely for 3 exhausting weeks. We were thankful for our great tower, as it proved to be key in firing our crossbows and aiming our cannons. We killed 2 of the Duke's men. No one from the county of Norfolk had answered my mother Margaret's calls for help, and despite our men's efforts and the impressive defensive design of the castle, we were forced to surrender or face certain death. Our supplies had finally run out, and we would surely be killed of starvation before the cannons took us. Thankfully, I was able to negotiate our surrender, and the Duke allowed us to retreat unharmed. However, the loss was more than a bitter blow for us Pastons. The violence had taken the life of our most loyal servant, Daubeny, killed by a crossbow bolt. Margaret's cousin and my uncle Bernie was badly wounded. The castle itself suffered severe damage, as it was never built to withstand such a long attack from cannon fire. Haunted by the capture of our home, it was to be years before the Duke died, and the castle was rightfully returned to our family. Us Pastons have always been busy people, and I will admit that perhaps we hadn't looked after the building well enough before the attack. Perhaps if we'd taken better care of it, we wouldn't have lost it in the battle. Our family owned the castle for another 100 years. It's seen a lot of history, and it still stands today. You should visit it sometime. How about climbing the tower and imagining firing arrows down on the Duke's army, or crossing the moat and walking round by the wall, just as we Pastons did all those years ago?
In those years, the men of the family often had to be at court in London. The letters tell us things they had to do there during the time we call the Wars of the Roses. King Henry VI had been a weak king, and there was a great dispute as to which of his relatives should be kings after him. All the lesser courtiers, like the Pastons, wanted to make sure they didn't end up on the losing side. They also had to fight legal battles in court, and sometimes away from the courts, with swords, crossbows and shields, to keep the lands they had inherited in Norfolk. Lord Mullanes said the Pastons had cheated him out of the ownership of Gresham Castle. He sent 1,000 men to the castle and threw out Margaret Paston and the few servants she had there. Life for the Pastons was always adventurous. The family had built themselves a great hall in the village of Paston, and then they built another huge house at Oxnead. Clement Paston had gone off to sea in the time of Henry VIII.
Good day to you all. I'm Clement Paston. There have been several Clement Pastons before me, though perhaps not as many Clements as there are Williams in the family. My father was a William, as was my nephew. I live a quieter life these days, back at the home I've built, Oxnead Hall. The family has owned it for quite a while, but I've completely rebuilt it. When you're a wealthy man, you have to show off a bit. I've created water meadows and terraces stretching down to the river, and on a fine summer's day, it's a glorious place to sit or walk. In fact, if you walk the path the other side of the river, even today you can still see how grand a house it must have been. I grew up in the time of King Henry VIII. You've probably heard of him. Very difficult sometimes to remember who he was married to. However, this was no problem for me, as brothers Thomas and John and I were all in royal service with Henry. We were all called gentlemen pensioners. That doesn't mean we were old. It means we were soldiers and sailors in the King's service. It was the life of a sailor for me. I must have been about 30 when I had my first command. She was the Hone of Hamburg, a ship the King rented from the merchants of the Hanseatic League. Next, I went on to command the Pelican of Danzig, but my real luck was in as captain of the Anne Gallant. That's when we captured the French ship, the Mermaid. We were a sailing ship and the Mermaid was a galley, meaning she was rowed rather than powered by the wind, like us. That's when we captured the Baron of St. Blanchard and his men. I imprisoned him at Caister Castle and took the rewards from his ransom and the plunder from the ship. Does that make me a pirate? Certainly not. We were often fighting against the French, and if you were acting under the King's command, you were part of his powerful and well-organised navy. Sometimes I led soldiers on land as well, and was wounded twice at the Battle of Pinkie. That was a bloody affair, across the border and against the Scots. My experience proved very useful then, as the army on the land and the ships at sea operated together as they moved up the east coast of Britain. I made a slip when Lady Jane Grey became Queen for those 9 days. All of us gentlemen pensioners took her side, and it took a bit of manoeuvring to get back in with Queen Mary. Just like some of my ancestors making the wrong choice and having to worm our way back into favour. When our present Queen Elizabeth took the throne, I was known as a loyal servant to her. Under her reign, I returned to Oxnead and worked with the Duke of Norfolk, who organised for me to be a Member of Parliament for the county. That's when I married Alice Packington. The union worked well. My wife had inherited a great deal of money which helped us to build the hall at Oxnead. I was kept busy with being an MP and with other responsibilities in the county. Alice and I didn't have any children, so it was my nephew, Sir William, back at Paston Hall, to whom I left most of my fortune. I enjoyed my life at sea. That's what I'm best known for. Some people call me Admiral Clement, but that wasn't quite an official title like you have admirals today. Just think of me as a sea captain in that time when Henry and Elizabeth began to build properly armed fighting ships to venture round the world and defend England against her enemies. I'll be happy with that. I've made arrangements for my tomb in Oxnead Church. It's going to have a fine carving of me in my best military outfit and a list of my achievements, particularly my service to royalty. Sadly, my wife has already died, but I've arranged for a small plaque for her to go on the tomb as well. Must make sure things are done properly.
While some of you may have encountered the Paston heritage through such buildings as Oxnead and Paston Halls, for others your connection might be having gone to school in North Walsham to Paston College, while others among you may have seen the magnificent Paston treasure painting which now hangs in Norwich Castle Museum. But how does the school and the painting come into the story? For this we need to turn first to Clement's nephew, Sir William Paston.
I've lived most of my life at the family home, Paston Hall. This has meant that I've often been a visitor to the nearby market town of North Walsham, particularly when I've been on my way to Norwich. I haven't travelled further a great deal. Our family estates and the government and political life in Norfolk have kept me far too busy for that. My early schooling and tutoring was in North Walsham, and then I was able to go to Gonville Hall at Cambridge. Education of the next generation has always been one of my greatest interests. After leaving college, I worked with my friend and patron, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, and built up a reputation for being a good administrator and a just and painstaking magistrate, helping to keep the law of the land. I eventually became Sir William in 1578 because of my public work. North Walsham has always been a busy and bustling place, but it never had a proper school. Aylsham, not so far away, had a grammar school, and of course there were good schools in Yarmouth and Norwich. So it had always been on my mind to set up a school in the town. Matters were put into action when tragedy struck in North Walsham. We've always known of the dangers of fire. One of the family houses in Norwich had been destroyed in a great fire there, but our wooden and thatched buildings were always at risk. It started at the house of a man called Dow and quickly spread through the town. The market around the church was lost, as well as over 100 houses. I did what I could to help. I gave some money to everyone in the town. However, the fire cleared 2 acres of land to the south of the market, which I bought in order to start my school. Boys were soon being taught there, and in 1606 we established a fund to help it in the future.
Another Paston who enjoyed learning was Edward Paston, the cousin of William. He was the builder of Barningham Hall, and his memorial that can still be seen today in Blowfield Church contains the images of his 9 children. Let's hear from Edward.
To place a queen whom fates refuses, a sacred tomb to give a fame immortal. Welcome, sir and madam. My name is Edward Paston. I was just thinking about the music that my friend William Bird has sent me to go with the verses I have written. Do you have tunes that go round and round in your head, or melodies that you sing along with absent-mindedly? Music is my great love. Here at the end of the 16th century, in the time of our good Queen Elizabeth, we greatly enjoy our theatre and music. You'll know of our famous playwright, William Shakespeare, and we have several new theatres being built in London. My father Thomas served our late King Henry VIII. He taught the King's daughter, Princess Mary, to play the virginal, a type of harpsichord. Not all is good for us right now. The Protestant religion of the country makes life very difficult for those of us who are Roman Catholics, like our part of the Paston family. I was educated in another country, in Spain. It gave me the chance to speak other languages, and I learned to play the lute with the great Spanish masters. I have composed several sets of words and tunes for the instrument. I wonder, do you play an instrument? Do you know about the lute? It's a stringed instrument that I play by plucking it with my fingers, or with a plectrum. It has a large rounded soundbox and 8 courses with 2 strings for each course. Though there are all sorts of other lutes. Here, let me play you a piece of an Italian melody.
Greetings, gentle sirs and ladies. I am William Paston, one of several of that name in the family. I was born in the time of King James, in the year 1610. The first Charles was king when I went to Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge. Though it's sometimes a bit embarrassing for me, you can read the many letters my mother wrote to me while I was there. She was a bit of a fusspot, constantly telling me what I should and shouldn't do. She really didn't like me playing tennis or other energetic sports,
but I did learn to love the arts while I was there. When my father died, I became one of the richest men in Norfolk. I inherited Oxnead Hall and Paston Hall, and made sure I visited and supported the school in North Walsham that my great-grandfather William had founded. I married Catherine Bertie, and we had 5 children, but alas, Catherine then died in childbirth. I had my friend, the great sculptor Nicholas Stone, design a beautiful memorial for her. You can still see it today in Oxnead Church. I was so sad about the death of my wife that I decided to go away for a bit. I travelled to Florence in Italy, the Middle East, and Egypt. I collected curious and precious things on my travels. You can see many of them in a painting I commissioned. I was even chased by a crocodile by the River Nile. I had many books in the library at Oxnead about the lands of the Middle East. I read many stories about places before my companion and I left to visit them. I travelled with Nicholas Stone, the son of the sculptor I mentioned. In some ways, those countries were dangerous places to travel, but we found some good guides to help us on the way. Back in England, times became very difficult for me in the early 1640s. I liked the king, but also wanted to keep on good terms with many of my friends and neighbours who did not. Civil war broke out across the whole of the country. We didn't have any of the really big battles here in Norfolk, but we used to get news from other counties. Eventually King Charles was captured and executed. Lord Protector Cromwell took over to govern the country. It was a time of huge disagreement. There were lots of rules and regulations, and we weren't even allowed to celebrate Christmas in those days. At one point during the war, I decided to leave England and go to Holland. On my return, I paid an enormous fine for being allowed to stay at my own house at Oxnead. I kept clear of trouble, but my late wife Catherine's family played a major part in the Civil War. They fought on the King's side. I lived quietly after the Troubles, and I enjoyed spending time with my son Robert and our friend Sir Thomas Browne. We helped Sir Thomas with some of his discoveries of Roman burial urns on the far bank of the River Bure, across from Oxnead Hall. We particularly enjoyed our conversations with Sir Thomas about art and natural philosophy. He was a brilliant man. King Charles II came back as King of England for the last few years of my life. I kept up my family and county responsibilities. I was able to leave our estates to my son Robert in reasonable order, though that fine I had paid in the time of Oliver Cromwell had set us back badly. Still, I've enjoyed life with my love of art and of natural philosophy. You'd now call it science. And I do hope the family can maintain its way of life here at Oxnead in the years ahead.
Good day to you. I'm Lady Charlotte Weldon, but my surname was Paston before I married. I grew up with my sister Rebecca and my brothers William and Charles at Oxnead Hall in Norfolk. We're living now in Georgian times, with George II as king of what we now call Great Britain. Charles II was king of England when I was a child. My mother told me that he was my grandfather, but I never met him. The king did come once to our house at Oxnead, but that was before I was born. Later on, I learned my brother had been called Charles after the king. My father, William Paston, was an important man in Norfolk. He was the Earl of Yarmouth. One of my earliest memories is when he arranged for an artist to come to Oxnead and paint portraits of myself, my brothers and my sister. I remember it because each of us had to sit still for so long. We would far rather have been playing outside. It was a great big house, but best of all were the gardens and lawns. The gardens stretched down to the River Bure in beautiful terraces. Boats went up and down the river, carrying crops from the fields down to the harbour at Great Yarmouth, and bringing all sorts of things back to us and the town of Aylsham. We were lucky enough to have another lovely house at Paston, near the sea. We were able to play so many games at Oxnead. It was a very happy time for us. We could play tag all over the house and the gardens. The hopscotch on the paving stones was one of our favourites. Sack races were good fun, but long skirts get in the way. Leapfrog is difficult for girls. It's easier for the boys, wearing breeches. We enjoyed the game of quoits, throwing rings onto sticks and practising our aim. The grass was just the place for rolling our large hoops, and we could play ninepins there as well. But the paving was best for spinning our wooden whip tops. But most of all, I did love my rocking horse. Have you ever been on one? We used to enjoy it so much when there was a party at the house. We were allowed to watch when the ladies and gentlemen arrived in their grand clothes and jewels. Most of the men wore long wigs. The men, that is, also loved frills, lace and ribbons. And the ladies had large skirts, puffy sleeves and lace. We had a housekeeper at Oxnead and a wonderful cook. Our favourites were apple duffs, Dutch pudding and lavender sugar. Sugar came all the way from the West Indies and America, so sweet things were a huge treat. I remember one special room at Oxnead, though we couldn't play there. It was full of pictures and precious objects which I was sometimes allowed to hold. In another room, where we kept all the estate papers, I remember seeing lots of old letters. My grandfather told me some of them were over 200 years old. I wonder what happened to them. But all those things are now in the past. I grew up and married when Queen Anne was on the throne. I married Thomas Hearn, and we had 4 children of our own, but sadly my husband died in 1726. My father also died a few years later, and it was only then that I found out how much money he owed. He had tried all sorts of ventures and borrowed lots of money, but hadn't been good at looking after our land and houses. So now there is nothing to do but to sell everything. It is a truly horrendous job. But luckily my new husband, Thomas, Colonel Weldon, is able to help me. We will have to try and sell all the land. I hope it will raise enough money to pay back all that is owed. Because both my brothers died before they had children of their own, there are no men left called Paston to carry on the name. All my children have the surname Hearn from my first husband. My father sold all the furniture at Oxnead, even the fireplaces, and they tell me that the beautiful house is a ruin now. I can't bear to go there, and I'm still wondering what happened to all those letters.
Fortunately, in the spring of 1735, the famous Norfolk historian Francis Bloomfield secured permission to spend 2 weeks in that muniment room in the dilapidated hall. He discovers several sacks full of Paston correspondence, letters to and from members of the family, letters to and from their servants. He must have been amazed. 3 years later, Francis Bloomfield had catalogued and marked the documents he had found. When he died in 1752, his widow called on another antiquary, a historian with a special interest in old documents, honest Tom Martin, to help sort out all his papers. By 1755, Martin had bought the whole collection. He had a neighbour, John Fenn, the next person in the story, and a very important one. John Fenn had recently been at Gonville and Caius Hall, part of Cambridge University. The collection passed to Fenn, and he also got more Paston letters from other sources. John Fenn told Horace Walpole, son of Prime Minister Robert Walpole, about the letters. Horace said they were the most curious papers of the sort I ever saw. He told John Fenn they ought to be printed in a book. So Fenn sorted them all out, ready for printing. He even developed a special sort of type that looked like the original writing. He persuaded King George III to allow the first volume to be dedicated to him, and so the letters could now be bought as books. The first edition soon ran out because so many people bought copies, and so they had to print another lot. Another historian, James Gardner, worked on the papers at the beginning of the 20th century, finding more letters, and he produced a further set of books. And ever since then, historians have discovered more and more fascinating details about the letters.
If you would like to find out more about the Paston story and see animations of even more Paston characters, visit our community research portal at thisispaston.co.uk. Or to find out the latest 21st century chapter of the Paston story, that is on silencing the voices of the Paston women, visit our website where you can find out details about the Paston women throughout the centuries, including creative modern imaginings of them. Visit pastonfootprints.co.uk.